All right, today we're going to talk about embedding quotes in your body paragraphs, the correct way to include quoted evidence. Now, when you're using paraphrased evidence, it is more or less the same sequence. It is more or less the same setup and format of things. The only difference is you don't have to worry about the grammatic function of trying to fit the quote within your own sentence. So really, we're focusing on quoted evidence for this. And anytime you're using quoted evidence, you've got to start thinking about embedding it. I promise you're going to lose points if you just drop it in as its own sentence. That is the old way of doing things. That's not how we do it now. So take a look. I'm going to get rid of my video for a second. The article discusses many uses for onions. Cool. You've introduced what you're going to talk about for sure. Now, if you just drop in a sentence that is a quote on its own, you've included evidence, but you haven't really worked on putting it into your own writing. You've dropped it in, and then you've made an effort to explain it. This shows that onions can be used in stew, but you haven't really done the legwork of analyzing anything, nor have you done the work as a writer of properly embedding your quote in your writing. But Mr. Munoz, we used to do it this way. Why is it incorrect now? Well, we're growing as writers, so you have to grow your ability to incorporate evidence as well. You've got to become better at thinking more critically of how you incorporate evidence and thinking more critically about how you analyze and comment on evidence that you've chosen. You've got to try to make the quote flow with the rest of your sentence, and that is the best way to get quoted evidence into your piece. It should sound like it almost came from you in the first place. If it truly supports your argument, that makes sense. It's something that you're arguing for. It's something that you need support for. It should sound that it's coming. It should sound as if it's coming from you, except that somebody else wrote it, and that lends so much strength to your argument, because if someone else thinks it too, you've got to be right. Maybe even 5 people think it. Maybe 6 different books think the same thing as you, and that makes your argument sound even stronger. So the focus of this is the focus of introducing the quote and explaining the quote are providing context for the evidence analysis, right? You don't want to talk about the writing. You want to talk about writing in general. You don't want to talk about this shows or this quote demonstrates or in this essay. Well, of course, we don't want to use first person at all, but the last thing we want to talk about is in this essay, I will prove to you that onions are important for cooking. No, we know that. That should be clear in your thesis. So don't talk about writing in your writing. You don't have to say this shows, this quote shows, the author is trying to say. We know that. Say something a little more interesting. Okay, so let's break through the anatomy of evidence, third time. This is your introduction, right? And now I've used the incorrect paragraph to go through the anatomy of evidence so we can revise it later on in the presentation. The article discusses many uses for onions. Okay, you were talking about an article, and we're going to be talking about onions and all their different uses. Great. Here's your quote. Onions can be used in stews. Awesome. This is from, now you've got a proper citation in there, Allium, and you've got a page number 50. Amazing. And now you've provided an explanation, some analysis for why you've chosen to include the quote. You're explaining how it fits into your argument. This shows that onions can be used in stew. Now, this is wrong. This is incorrect in the sense that it's not what I want to see you writing like, but it is doing the job of what the things you need to do to include in your paragraph are doing, right? It's got introduction, it's got a quote, and it's got analysis. And I've color-coded these for you. Hopefully the colors are clear. All right, let's talk more closely about introductions. You are really trying to rely on your own words here. We are trying to shrink down the amount of quote you actually need. If your quote is going over 2 lines, your quote is probably 2 lines of your own, size 12 Times New Roman, double-spaced MLA formatted paper. Your quote is probably too long. And the only times in writing in general when you really need those long quotes, it's usually scientific writing or statistical writing or something that requires you to really bring in the fact that the author of whatever the quote is coming from did their legwork and is proven to be true. But you're not going to have to do that in my class, at least. You have to rely on your own writing to fully introduce where the quote is coming from, to fully give context for what the quote is talking about. So you're clarifying. You might have to clarify who's speaking in the quote, especially if you're talking about fiction. Winston locked in the Ministry of Love, starving for food, tortured by the thought police, says, and then there's the quote. You've given the full context for what the quote, where the quote is coming from. Maybe you're writing about many different texts. Maybe you're writing about 4, 5, 6 different sources in your essay. You might have to clarify which text the quote is coming from. That makes sense. We certainly wouldn't want to mix up the fact that your quote is coming from The Social Dilemma if you're talking about 1984, or that your quote is coming from Fahrenheit 451 if you're talking about Macbeth. You want to make sure you clarify what text the quote is coming from if you're using multiple texts in your essay. You also want to set the scene for the words that you've chosen to quote, which, if you're doing both other things adequately, you probably have already set the scene. But perhaps maybe you want to provide more atmosphere, especially if you're writing about fiction, for how the characters are feeling or what the characters are going through when they say your chosen quote. So let's look at this revised example. I've fixed up the example from earlier. Go away, little bar. In her book, Onions by the Pound, Charlotte Alliam discusses uses for onions that the average consumer might not recognize. Okay, well, now we're talking about the book, now we've got the author, and now we've got a brief overview of what she's going to say. Me as the author, me as the essay writer, I've got to do all this work of making sure my reader knows what it is they're going to read about. She does, however, remain loyal to the more traditional uses of the vegetable, even going so far as to remind the reader that onions can be used in stews. Oh, and now I've given even more context for what she's talking about. It's clear that I read the article, it's clear that I understand what the author is trying to say, and it should become clear that I know why I'm including it in my essay. I know why I've included it and why I'm going to, and how I'm going to connect it back to my thesis, or how I'm going to connect it back to my topic. So that's what a proper introduction to a quote would look like, and a properly embedded quote. So now we're going to talk about the different ways of embedding a quote in your own writing. You've got 2 options, and neither option is better than another. It'll really depend on what kind of quote you're using, or how the quote itself is written. You can flow quote, which require no punctuation before the quote. My example from the last slide included a flow quote. And this is because the words of the quote grammatically fit together with the sentence that you're already writing. So here's an example. They may not be suitable for every kind of dish, but onions can be used in stews. And now that is, properly, there's an error here, actually. I forgot to put a period after the citation, but it's flowed through entirely. No punctuation is needed before the quote, right? I've got punctuation before a conjunction, but in terms of how the quote fits into my sentence, I don't need any punctuation. It flows entirely. It's almost as if the words came from me and not this made-up author I'm writing about. A dialogue quote requires punctuation before the quote, just like writing dialogue. Okay, when I can't believe that just happened, comma, Jenny said. The example here, challenging widespread assumptions about the flexibility of onions. Alliam says, comma, onions can be used in stews. And then I've got a citation and a period there. Either one is fine. These are both good ways of incorporating evidence. Flow quotes might sound a little fancier, but the reality is not every quote is going to be able to fit in grammatically into what kind of sentence you're writing. Especially in writing about fiction, most fiction is written in past tense, but when you write about fiction, you have to write about the events in the novel in present tense. So a lot of times those don't line up. Dialogue quotes help you mash the two together a little bit more nicely. Okay, and then some analysis and commentary, the last thing you have to do. The goal of analysis is to connect your evidence back to your argument. You are looping back whatever you chose to include in some way has to support your thesis, or at least should. If it doesn't support your thesis or doesn't support the topic sentence of your paragraph, we've got bigger problems than how you choose to incorporate evidence, right? The goal of any essay is to prove your thesis, to argue your thesis, and to show support for why your thesis is correct. So you might be connecting the quote that you included all the way back to your thesis, or you're just simply connecting it back to the topic sentence or the topic idea of your paragraph. You've got to make the connections clear. You can't rely on your reader to just understand your train of thought. Especially, you can't just say, this shows how my topic is correct. You've got to show that the line between your quote and your topic, or your quote and your thesis, has to be carefully laid out for your reader. You're including quotes to support your argument. You're also including quotes to support the requirements of the essay, but the purpose of the quote itself is to lend support to your evidence, to your argument. That's why it's called supporting evidence. So that is your main focus when you're providing commentary. Do not simply summarize what the quote says. You already included the quote. We've seen it. You don't need to summarize it. You need to explain why it's important. Let's take a look at an example. And I've put it in the context of a whole paragraph that is all revised and ready to go. And I've included two in gray over here. This is the topic of the paragraph, and this is the beginning of the argument. So even before I get a full body paragraph is not just introduction, quote, explanation. You still need some topic sentence. You still need to talk about your argument. And after this, I would say that this would be even better if I transition to another quote, talk about another quote, and then end the whole paragraph with a final transition sentence. So this is far from complete. And just talking about evidence is even further from a complete body paragraph. So let's take a look at this. Onions provide powerful aromas, tastes, and complexities to dishes across many cultures. All right, so now we're going to argue the fact that onions are important to cooking, right? They provide all these things, and they're common across many different kinds of cultures. Though many people consider onions as a secondary raw ingredient for salads and sandwiches, cooking the vegetable can lead to intense and exciting flavor profiles. So now I've elaborated on my argument a little bit that a lot of people think about onions just as being a raw thing, and you can actually cook them to utilize them better. Now, obviously, people know this already. I just wanted to try to use an example that was straightforward. So I'm arguing here that you've got to access the full the powerful aromas, tastes, and complexities, you're going to have to try to cook it too. Now we've come back to the introduction of the quote. My argument has been laid out. I'm introducing the quote. In her book, Onions by the Pound, Charlotte Allium discusses uses for onions that the average consumer might not recognize. She does, however, remain loyal to the more traditional uses of the vegetable, even going so far as to remind the reader that onions can be used in stews. We've got a quote in there. By cooking the vegetable for a significant time, as one does when making stew, the onion's flavors can fully meld with the other ingredients of the dish. Now, I've explained the quote. I've actually even included information that she's told me too that isn't in the quote. Because if I used the whole quote, I'm imagining, I would have had about a paragraph of quote in there, and I've hewn it down, I've chopped it down all the way to only the little bit that I really, really, really need. So I've elaborated even further on how it fits into my argument by providing additional information. And now I've wrapped it all up. In fact, recognizing the importance of onions in stew is foundational to respecting the vegetable as a central player in aromatic cooking. I've even brought in a word that I used in my topic sentence. I've completely connected the idea in the quote back to the idea of my topic sentence of my argument. I'm not sure what the thesis of this essay looks like. I have not written an entire fake essay about onions, but I hope that you can think of a nice one. And I hope that this makes incorporating evidence a little more straightforward for you. Again, what we're really trying to avoid this year is just dropping in a quote as its own sentence without any of your own writing around it. And by around it, I don't mean, you have a separate introduction sentence and a separate analysis sentence. I mean around it as in it exists in a total void. It is just a quote, a citation, and a period, and you have done no effort to make the sentence any fuller, any more complete. And that your analysis talks specifically about how it connects back to your thesis, and that we do not talk about writing while we are writing. This quote says, the author wants to say. You can do better than that. All right, that's it. Good luck.